You've been planning this trip for 2 years. You have a folder on your phone with 200 saved photos, the cafe on the corner of Rue Clay, the view from Sacré-Cœur at golden hour, the bookshop by the Seine that everyone says changed their life. You've watched the films, you've read the novels. You have, in your head, a version of Paris so detailed and so beautiful that it feels almost like a memory of somewhere you've already been. And then you land, and the taxi smells like cigarettes, and the waiter at the first cafe doesn't smile, and the Eiffel Tower is smaller than you expected and surrounded by tourists selling keychains, and the streets, which were supposed to feel like stepping into a painting, just feel like streets. And something in you quietly breaks. Most people shake it off, they adjust. They find the real city underneath the imagined one and fall in love with that instead. But for a small number of people every year, almost exclusively Japanese tourists, the gap between the Paris they imagined and the Paris they found triggers something far more serious than disappointment. It triggers a psychiatric breakdown. In the 1980s, a Japanese psychiatrist named Hiroaki Ota was working in Paris when he began noticing a pattern among his Japanese patients that he had never encountered anywhere else. They were arriving in Paris, often for the first time, often after years of anticipation, and within days they were presenting at his clinic with a cluster of symptoms that didn't fit any standard diagnosis. Dizziness, heart palpitations, sweating, feelings of persecution, hallucinations, acute anxiety so severe it required hospitalization, and in almost every case, the symptoms had begun not from any physical cause but from the collision between expectation and reality. Oda documented the cases. He published a paper. He named the condition after the city that kept producing it. He called it Paris syndrome. Now, the obvious question is why Japanese tourists specifically? Visitors from every country experience disappointment. Every traveler has arrived somewhere expecting magic and found something more ordinary. But Paris syndrome, as a documented clinical phenomenon with hospitalization rates and psychiatric intervention, appears almost exclusively in Japanese visitors. The number of cases is relatively small. Roughly 12 Japanese tourists are repatriated from Paris every year by the Japanese embassy, which maintains a dedicated 24-hour hotline specifically for this purpose, with symptoms severe enough to require medical attention. In a city that receives millions of Japanese visitors annually, the rate is tiny, but the consistency of who it affects and why has fascinated psychiatrists for decades. The explanation begins in Japan. France, and Paris specifically, occupies a unique psychological space in Japanese popular culture. For decades, French culture has been portrayed in Japanese media, fashion, advertising, and literature as the pinnacle of elegance, romance, and sophistication. Paris is not just a city in Japanese cultural imagination. It is an idea, a symbol, a perfect world made of cobblestones and candlelight and effortless beauty. Japanese bookshops have entire sections dedicated to Paris lifestyle guides. Japanese television has produced hundreds of programs romanticizing French daily life. Japanese fashion has been so thoroughly influenced by a particular vision of Parisian chic that the aesthetic has its own name. It's called the Paris look, and it bears only a passing resemblance to what Parisians actually wear. The Paris that exists in Japanese popular culture is a construction, a beautiful, detailed, internally consistent fiction. And then people fly 12 hours to meet it in person. The real Paris, encountered after a lifetime of the fictional one, produces a specific kind of shock that psychiatrists call a reality gap. But for Japanese visitors, the gap is wider than for almost anyone else, and it's made wider still by something cultural rather than geographical. Japan and France have almost opposite social codes. In Japan, politeness is structural. Customer service is an art form taken with extraordinary seriousness. Staff bow. Complaints are handled with elaborate care. The social contract between a business and its customer is one of the most refined in the world. Rudeness in a service context isn't just unpleasant, it's a genuine violation of a deeply held social norm. French customer service operates on entirely different principles. Waiters are not there to perform happiness for you. Eye contact is not automatically offered. A brusque response to a question is not considered rude. It's just efficient. The social codes that govern public interaction in France are simply different from the ones that govern it in Japan. For a Japanese visitor already disoriented by the gap between the imagined and real Paris, encountering a waiter who seems actively hostile, when in reality they're simply French, can feel like a personal attack. The brain, already under stress, begins interpreting neutral interactions as threatening ones. And to better explain this, Paris syndrome sits at the intersection of three things that travel does to the human brain at the same time. The first is the expectation gap, the collision between an imagined place and a real one, which every traveler experiences to some degree. The second is cultural dissonance, the disorientation of operating inside a social code you don't understand, where every interaction feels slightly wrong and you can't identify why. And the third is something psychiatrists call the exhaustion of coping resources. Travel is cognitively demanding in ways that don't feel obvious. Navigating an unfamiliar language, an unfamiliar transit system, unfamiliar food, unfamiliar social norms, all of it draws from the same mental reservoir. For most people, that reservoir is deep enough to handle the demands. For some, under the right conditions, it runs out. When all three hit simultaneously, when the city isn't what you imagined, and the social interactions feel wrong, and the brain has run out of capacity to cope, the result can be something that looks, from the outside, like a breakdown, because that is exactly what it is. And from there, the spiral can move quickly. The symptoms that follow are not metaphorical. They are documented, measurable, and in serious cases, genuinely dangerous. Hallucinations. Feelings of being watched or followed, acute depersonalization, the sense that you are watching yourself from outside your own body. Paranoia, in the most severe cases, complete psychological breaks requiring sedation and emergency repatriation. The Japanese embassy in Paris takes this seriously enough to staff a 24-hour psychological support line in Japanese specifically because of it. When a tourist calls in crisis, the embassy can arrange medical support, translation, and if necessary, a medically supervised flight home. The treatment, in most cases, is simply removal from Paris. Once patients return to Japan, to familiar language, familiar social codes, familiar sensory environment, the symptoms resolve relatively quickly. The breakdown was environmental, the cure is geographical. Paris hasn't changed to accommodate this. The waiters are still French. The streets are still streets. The Eiffel Tower is still the same height it has always been. What Paris syndrome actually reveals isn't a flaw in the city. It's a flaw in the distance between the places we build in our minds and the ones that actually exist.